Most people think the story of the American automobile began with Henry Ford in a small garage in Detroit. They think of the assembly line, the Model T, and the birth of the 20th century. But they are off by more than 50 years. Before there was a Ford, before there was a Dodge, and long before there was a Chevrolet, there was a name that defined American movement. It was a name etched into the side of the wagons that carried pioneers across the Great Plains. It was a name that provided the wheels for the Union Army during the Civil War. It was a name that bridged the gap between the era of the horse and the era of the internal combustion engine. That name was Studebaker. For 114 years, Studebaker was the sturdy choice. They weren't just a car company, they were a cornerstone of American industrial might. They survived the transition from wood to steel, from hay to gasoline. They outlasted hundreds of competitors and survived the Great Depression. So how does a company with a half-century head start on the competition, a company that was once the largest vehicle manufacturer in the world, simply vanish? How did the sturdy Studebaker become a ghost? Was it a failure of engineering, a victim of corporate greed, or simply a brand that the world moved past? Today, we look back at the longest, most dramatic saga in automotive history. From the blacksmith forge to the edge of the space age, this is the complete story of Studebaker. To understand Studebaker, you have to understand its reputation. In the mid-20th century, if you bought a Studebaker, you were making a statement. You weren't a show-off like a Cadillac owner, and you weren't looking for the bare-bones thrift of a Ford. You were a person of taste. You valued engineering, durability, and a certain forward-thinking design that the Big Three in Detroit often lacked. Studebaker was the independent. They were based in South Bend, Indiana, far enough from Detroit to maintain their own culture, but close enough to compete for the soul of the American driver. Throughout its history, the brand stood for two things: trust and innovation. They built the wagons that won the West, and they built the cars that pioneered the look of the post-World War II era. But being an independent in a world of giants is a dangerous game. As we will see, Studebaker's unique identity was both its greatest strength and the very thing that made it vulnerable to the predatory tactics of the giants in Detroit. The story begins in February 1852. Two brothers, Clement and Henry Studebaker, opened a blacksmith and wagon shop in South Bend, Indiana. They started with a capital of just $68 and two sets of blacksmith tools. But the Studebakers weren't just blacksmiths, they were perfectionists. Their motto was simple: always give more than you promise. By the time the American Civil War broke out in 1861, the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company was perfectly positioned. They won massive government contracts to build wagons, ambulances, and caissons for the Union Army. The war made them wealthy, but it was the aftermath that made them legendary. As America pushed west, they did so on Studebaker wheels. The Studebaker wagon became the gold standard of the frontier. Soon, three more brothers, John Moeller Jr., or J.M., Peter, and Jacob, joined the firm. J.M., in particular, became the driving force of the company. He had spent years in the California gold rush, not mining for gold, but building wheelbarrows for miners. He returned to South Bend with a fortune in gold dust and a vision to make Studebaker a global power. By the 1870s, Studebaker was the largest producer of horse-drawn vehicles in the world. Their factory in South Bend covered 100 acres. They were the only firm that could boast they provided transportation for every U.S. president from Abraham Lincoln to Teddy Roosevelt. But the winds of change were blowing. At the turn of the century, a horseless carriage began to appear on the muddy roads of Indiana. While other wagon makers laughed at the noisy, vibrating machines, the Studebaker brothers did something unexpected. They embraced them. However, they didn't start with gasoline. In 1902, Studebaker entered the automotive world with an electric car. It was clean, quiet, and designed by the legendary Thomas Edison. For a moment, it looked like Studebaker would lead the electric revolution, until a man named Henry Ford made the gasoline engine too cheap to ignore. Realizing that electricity was limited by the battery technology of the day, Studebaker moved into gasoline-powered cars in 1904. Not wanting to reinvent the wheel, they initially partnered with the Garford Company of Ohio. Studebaker would build the chassis and bodies, and Garford would provide the engines. By 1911, Studebaker took full control of its destiny. They acquired the EMF Company and began marketing cars solely under the Studebaker name. This was the era of the Big Six and the Special Six, cars that were renowned for being sturdy. During World War I, just as they had during the Civil War, Studebaker stepped up for the war effort. They produced thousands of trucks and ambulances for the Allied forces. By the end of the war in 1918, the last of the founding brothers, J.M. Studebaker, had passed away. The company was now in the hands of professional managers led by Albert Erskine. Erskine was ambitious. He didn't just want Studebaker to be a successful wagon maker turned car company. He wanted to rival General Motors. Under his leadership in the 1920s, Studebaker's sales soared. They built a massive proving ground, the first of its kind, and planted 5,000 pine trees to spell out the word Studebaker so it could be seen from the air. The company was at the top of the world. But Albert Erskine was about to make a series of financial gambles that nearly destroy everything the brothers had built. By 1929, Studebaker was a powerhouse. They were profitable, respected, and expanding. But Albert Erskine, the company's president, was blinded by his own ambition. He believed the 1929 stock market crash was a temporary correction. While Ford and GM were cutting costs and bracing for impact, Erskine did the unthinkable. He continued to pay out massive dividends to shareholders, draining the company's cash reserves. He gambled on a new low-priced brand called the Rockne, named after the legendary Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne. But it was too little, too late. By 1933, the company was hemorrhaging money. Studebaker went into receivership, the first major American car company to do so. The stress was too much for Albert Erskine. On July 1, 1933, he walked into his office and took his own life. The sturdy empire was on the brink of total liquidation. Two men stepped into the vacuum, Paul Hoffman and Harold Vance. They were the ultimate product men. They convinced the creditors that Studebaker was worth more alive than dead. They cut the fat, reorganized the plants, and focused on a single make-or-break car, the 1939 Studebaker Champion. The Champion was a masterstroke. It was light, fuel-efficient, and stylish, designed by the legendary Raymond Loewy. It was the car that saved Studebaker, proving that an independent could out-engineer the giants by being smarter and leaner. By 1940, Studebaker was back in the black. But the world was about to change again. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Studebaker ceased civilian production instantly. They became a vital cog in the arsenal of democracy. This wasn't just about trucks, though they built nearly 200,000 of the legendary US-6 2.5-ton trucks that kept the Soviet Red Army moving on the Eastern Front. It was about precision engineering. Studebaker was tasked with building the Wright Cyclone radial engines for the B-17 Flying Fortress. Every time a B-17 crew returned from a mission over Europe, they likely owed their lives to the South Bend workers who built their engines. By the end of the war, Studebaker had a reputation for quality that was second to none. They had the cash, they had the prestige, and they were ready to conquer the peace. In 1946, Detroit was lazy. The Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were simply rehashing their 1942 models, knowing that car-starved Americans would buy anything with wheels. Studebaker saw an opening.
Working with Raymond Loewy and Virgil Exner, they released the 1947 Starlight Coupe. It featured a wraparound rear window that looked like a cockpit. The slogan was legendary, "First by far with a post-war car." It made every other car on the road look like a relic from the 1930s. Then came 1950, the year of the bullet nose. With a chrome spinner in the center of the grille, the Studebaker looked like a fighter jet. It was radical, it was polarizing, and it was a massive success. In 1950, Studebaker sold 268,000 cars, their all-time record. For a moment, it looked like they might actually break into the Big Three. They had reached the summit. But as the saying goes, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Behind the beautiful designs, a rot was setting in. Studebaker's main factory in South Bend was a nightmare. It was a sprawling, multi-story brick complex built in the horse and buggy era. Parts had to be moved up and down elevators between floors, adding massive labor costs to every car. While Ford and GM were building modern single-story plants in the suburbs, Studebaker was trapped in the past. Their labor costs were the highest in the industry. They needed high volume just to break even, but a price war was coming that would make volume impossible to maintain. The sturdy company was about to face its greatest test, a predatory market and a disastrous merger that would begin the long, painful walk to the graveyard.
In 1953, Studebaker released what many historians consider the most beautiful American car ever mass-produced. Designed by Robert Bork from the Raymond Loewy Studios, the Studebaker Starliner was a revelation. It was lower, sleeker, and more European than anything Detroit had ever imagined. While other manufacturers were adding chrome and height, Studebaker went thin and aerodynamic. The design was so advanced that it won award after award and was later cited as a milestone by the Museum of Modern Art. But the Starliner was a beautiful tragedy. Studebaker's management made a fatal error. They underestimated the public's desire for the coupe. They expected to sell mostly four-door sedans, so they skewed their production line accordingly. When the public clamored for the sexy Starliner coupe, Studebaker couldn't build them fast enough. Worse yet, the initial production had body flex issues because the frame wasn't stiff enough for the pillarless design. By the time they fixed the engineering and ramped up production, the fever for the new model had cooled, and customers had grown tired of waiting. Just as Studebaker was struggling with production, a hurricane hit the automotive industry. In 1954, Ford and General Motors entered a cutthroat price war for market dominance. Henry Ford II was determined to make Ford the #1 brand again. He began overproducing cars and forcing dealers to sell them at razor-thin margins. GM fought back with its own massive discounts. This Ford Blitz was catastrophic for independent makers like Studebaker. They didn't have the economy of scale to survive a price war. Ford could lose money on a car and make it up in volume. Studebaker couldn't. Between 1953 and 1954, Studebaker's production plummeted by over 100,000 units. The company was bleeding cash, and for the first time since the Depression, the shadow of bankruptcy returned. In October 1954, a merger of necessity took place. Studebaker joined forces with Packard, the legendary luxury brand from Detroit. On paper, it was a dream team. Studebaker would provide the bread-and-butter family cars, and Packard would handle the high-end luxury market. But the merger was built on a foundation of lies. James Nance, the head of Packard, had been led to believe that Studebaker's break-even point was low. In reality, Studebaker's internal bookkeeping was a disaster. Once the Packard accountants got into the South Bend books, they were horrified. Studebaker needed to sell 300,000 cars a year just to break even, a number they hadn't hit in years.
Instead of Packard saving Studebaker, the struggling Indiana firm was now dragging the prestigious Packard brand into the abyss. The resources for the new corporation were stretched so thin that they couldn't afford to develop two separate platforms. By 1957, the proud Packard name, the car of kings and movie stars, had been reduced to a rebadged Studebaker. The loyal Packard customers were insulted. They saw through the disguise. Sales for the Packard line evaporated, and in 1958, the Packard name was discontinued for good. Studebaker was now alone again, standing in the middle of a massive, empty factory with no partner, no luxury division, and no clear path forward. The sturdy company was staring at the end of the road, but they had one final trick up their sleeve, a small car that would briefly bring them back from the dead.
By 1958, Studebaker was on life support. The merger with Packard had been a disaster, and the company was down to its last few $1,000,000. They couldn't afford to design a new car from scratch. They needed a miracle. That miracle was the Lark. Facing a build-or-die situation, Studebaker engineers did something brilliant. They took the existing full-sized Studebaker body and simply chopped the front and rear overhangs. They shortened the wheelbase and created a compact car before the term was even popular in Detroit. It was the right car at exactly the right time. In 1959, America was in a recession, and buyers were tired of the longer, lower, wider monsters from the Big Three. Studebaker sold over 130,000 Larks in its first year, turning a nearly $30 million profit. For a brief moment, the lights in South Bend stayed on. But the Lark honeymoon was short-lived. In 1960, the giants, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, finally released their own compact cars. With their massive marketing budgets and thousands of dealerships, they swamped the Lark. Studebaker sales plummeted. They had found the niche, but they didn't have the strength to hold it. By 1961, the company was back in the red. The board of directors brought in a new, young, and energetic president named Sherwood Egbert to find one last way out. Sherwood Egbert didn't want to just build sensible cars. He wanted a halo car that would bring people back into the showrooms. Legend has it he doodled the basic shape of a sports car on a cocktail napkin during a flight. He called Raymond Loewy out of retirement and gave him a nearly impossible deadline: design a world-class sports car in just 40 days. The result was the Studebaker Avanti. It was unlike anything America had ever seen. It had front disc brakes, a first for a major U.S. car, a built-in roll bar, and a fiberglass body. Under the hood, you could get a supercharged V8 that made it the fastest production car in the world. The Avanti was a sensation, but it was also a manufacturing nightmare. The fiberglass supplier couldn't get the panels to fit correctly. Orders were delayed for months. Disappointed customers canceled their orders and went to Chevrolet for a Corvette. The car that was supposed to save Studebaker instead became a symbol of its inability to execute big ideas. The end came on a cold Monday, December 9th, 1963. The board of directors had seen enough. The automotive division was losing millions, while their non-automotive branches, like STP Oil Treatment and Gravely Tractors, were profitable. They made the brutal decision to cut their losses. They announced that all automobile production in South Bend would cease immediately. More than 7,000 workers were laid off just weeks before Christmas. It was a crushing blow to the city that had been synonymous with Studebaker for over a century. In a final, desperate attempt to keep the name alive, they moved the remaining production to their small assembly plant in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. For 2 more years, Studebaker became Canada's own car. Because they had closed their engine foundry in South Bend, these final Studebakers were powered by Chevrolet V8s. The cars were actually high quality, and the operation was nearly profitable, but the volume was too low. By 1966, the dealer network in the U.S. had withered away. People were afraid to buy a car from a company that was half dead.
On March 16, 1966, the very last Studebaker, a Timberline turquoise cruiser, rolled off the line in Hamilton. After 114 years of moving people, the wheels finally stopped turning. Did Studebaker fail? In a business sense, yes, but their failure provides the ultimate lesson in industrial history. They failed because they were caught in the independence trap. They were too big to be a boutique manufacturer, but too small to compete with the sheer industrial volume of General Motors and Ford. They were burdened by ancient, multi-story factories and high labor costs that their competitors had already modernized. However, they left behind a legacy of firsts. They were the first to move from wagons to cars successfully. They pioneered the first real American compact car, the Lark. They brought safety features like disc brakes and roll bars to the masses. Perhaps their greatest legacy isn't the metal, but the people. When the South Bend plant closed, the failure of their pension plan led directly to the passage of ERISA, the federal law that protects your 401k and pension today. Even in death, Studebaker was still looking out for the American worker. The name Studebaker has been gone from the showroom for over 60 years, but you can still find it if you look closely. You find it in the lines of a modern European GT. You find it in the efficiency of a compact car, and you find it in the hearts of the collectors who refuse to let the sturdy brand die. They gave more than they promised for 114 years, and in the end, that is a success that no bankruptcy court can ever take away.